They have to split the car in half. You can't do that in a garage. There's just a few places in the world with the right equipment and only a few people in the world with the right training to be able to do that.
We started rebuilding the Bugatti Chiron Passport, which is Alex's, which is just right there.
Bugatti has finally broken its silence, and the response to Mat Armstrong is nothing like anyone expected. For months, Armstrong's ambitious rebuild project has pushed one of the world's most exclusive automotive brands into an uncomfortable spotlight. Every repair, every discovery, and every reveal.
So let's get the Bugatti out of here and start getting it to the workshop where we're going to rebuild it. And we're just going to pretend that everything that's happening now is completely normal.
Raised the same question. Would Bugatti respond? Now, they have. But instead of the reaction many predicted, the answer has taken a surprising turn. Behind the scenes, something far more complicated appears to be unfolding, one that could change how this entire story is remembered. So, what exactly did Bugatti say, and why has their response caught the automotive world off guard? Let's uncover what really happened. The drive nobody saw coming. Months of tension, blacklisted parts, and five-figure invoices all led to one moment. Armstrong finishing the Veyron rebuild and deciding to drive it, fully repaired, directly to Bugatti's headquarters in Molsheim. This wasn't a stunt dreamed up for views, nor was it some impulsive decision made in the heat of frustration. It was the natural, almost inevitable conclusion of everything that came before it. Bugatti had said, repeatedly and publicly, that the car couldn't be fixed safely outside their control. They had made that position clear through statements, through pricing, through outright refusals. Armstrong, on the other hand, had spent months proving otherwise, piece by piece, video by video, letting the work speak louder than any argument ever could. Taking the finished Veyron straight to the source felt like the only real way to settle the question that had defined the entire project from the very beginning. Could this actually be done right, outside the walls of an official service center, or not? Given everything that preceded it, the expectation going in was simple, almost predictable. Another rejection. Another legal disclaimer read out in careful corporate language. Maybe a repeat of the same caution Rimac had voiced from the very start of the saga, this time delivered in person, instead of through a written statement or a distant phone call. That's not what happened. Bugatti's response, when Armstrong actually showed up at their doorstep, broke the pattern entirely. For the first time in the entire saga, the company offered something that wasn't distance, wasn't dismissal, and wasn't another wall to run into. It was acknowledgement, an actual, positive reaction to the work sitting right in front of them. After a year defined by refusals, blacklists, and quiet warnings passed down through official channels, the company met Armstrong's finished Veyron with something closer to respect than resistance.
I've finally fixed the Bugatti Veyron and then attempted top speed. But it didn't go to plan. Oh no, something is seriously broken.
For anyone who had followed the story closely, that shift alone felt monumental. It's worth being precise, though, about what this moment was and wasn't, because it would be easy to overstate it. Bugatti didn't reverse its policy overnight, and they didn't suddenly declare that independent repair was the way forward. The company's core position, that these cars are safest when serviced through official channels, hadn't changed one bit. What shifted was smaller, quieter, and in some ways far more meaningful. A recognition that the work itself had been done with real skill, real care, and genuine attention to the exact details Bugatti cared about most. For Armstrong, that recognition mattered more than any part discount or service warranty ever could. He'd spent the better part of a year being told, directly and indirectly, that what he was attempting was reckless at best and outright dangerous at worst. He'd absorbed the criticism, paid the inflated invoices, and kept working anyway. Standing at Bugatti's own headquarters with a fully working Veyron was as close to vindication as this story was ever realistically going to get. The timing made it land even harder. This wasn't some early, easy win handed to him at the start of the journey. It came after the most expensive part, quote, of the entire project, after a public statement from the CEO explaining, point by point, exactly why this shouldn't work. It came after a second car got blacklisted entirely, seemingly to close off any remaining path forward. Every obstacle Bugatti put up along the way had been designed, intentionally or not, to make this exact outcome less likely. And yet here it was anyway, playing out in real time. For an audience that had followed every twist of the saga, the moment hit differently than a typical feel-good ending. It wasn't just about one car finally running properly again. It was about watching a year-long standoff.
Okay, it's annoying because you can't drive, if you want to drive it in handling mode where it's actually decent, the car's like that far off the floor, but now you have to drive it in motorway mode when it's a bit higher off the floor.
Between a garage mechanic and one of the most exclusive manufacturers on Earth, end without either side truly losing. Bugatti got to see, firsthand, that their caution hadn't been misplaced as a general principle, but that it also didn't apply cleanly to everyone who tried. Armstrong got the one thing he'd never actually asked for outright: recognition that he'd earned this, fair and square. The rejection that started it all. Mat Armstrong never planned on becoming Bugatti's biggest headache. He built his name fixing cars other people had given up on wrecked Lamborghinis, salvage Ferraris, anything with a busted title and a story worth telling. Over the years, he'd earned a reputation for taking on projects that other mechanics wouldn't even attempt. Cars that insurance companies had written off completely. Vehicles most people assumed were destined for the scrapyard. But nothing, not even years of tackling impossible rebuilds, prepared him for what happened when he brought a written-off Bugatti Veyron into his garage. The Veyron wasn't just another project car. It was one of the rarest, most complicated machines on the planet, built with a level of engineering that most independent mechanics never get anywhere near in their entire careers. Bugatti keeps it that way on purpose. The company controls almost every part of the car's life, from manufacturing to repair, and it doesn't hand that control to outsiders under any circumstances. So when word got out that Armstrong was rebuilding one in his own workshop, far from any authorized facility, the response from Molsheim was cold and immediate, arriving with a speed that suggested this wasn't a decision made lightly. Bugatti didn't threaten him outright. Instead, the company leaned on something quieter and more effective: distance. Officials made it known, through carefully worded statements and later through CEO Mat Armstrong directly, that they wanted nothing to do with the rebuild.
Without being able to buy parts to repair this Bugatti, it seemed like an impossible rebuild. And on top of that, even if we were able to buy parts, they were just extortionate.
The reasoning wasn't about ego, and it wasn't about protecting some abstract sense of exclusivity either. It was about liability. A Bugatti that fails on the road doesn't just embarrass the company in front of enthusiasts. It can kill someone, and the company's name would be attached to it regardless of who did the actual repair work, regardless of how careful or skilled that person turned out to be. Rimac laid out the company's position in blunt terms, refusing to soften the message even as public attention grew. He said the claims floating around about Bugatti's repair costs were mostly exaggerated, pushing back against some of the narrative building online. But he didn't back away from the core message. These cars were built to be serviced by Bugatti, and Bugatti alone. Anything else carried risk. The company wasn't willing to put its name behind. no matter how talented the mechanic or how good the intentions. It wasn't a threat. It was a wall, plain and simple. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A car company with billions in engineering resources telling a garage mechanic to walk away usually settles the argument then and there. But Armstrong didn't walk away. He'd built his entire audience on doing exactly what people said couldn't be done, one impossible rebuild at a time, and a Bugatti Veyron sitting in pieces in his shop wasn't going to change that pattern now. What made the situation stranger was the fact that Bugatti's leadership wasn't just vaguely aware of Armstrong's project somewhere in the background.
I'm now going to get to rebuild a Bugatti, learn about it, take you guys along with me, and not have to risk any of my own money.
They were watching it closely, video by video, update by update. Armstrong himself admitted he was caught off guard by how much attention it was getting inside the company itself. This wasn't a case of a small YouTuber operating under the radar, unnoticed by the industry. Executives at one of the most exclusive car manufacturers in the world were tracking every update, every setback, every part he sourced from wherever he could find it. That attention cut both ways. On one hand, it meant Armstrong's work was being taken seriously enough to draw a direct response from the top. On the other, it meant every mistake, every improvised fix, every workaround was happening in front of an audience that included the very people telling him it couldn't be done in the first place. There was no quiet corner to work in, no room for private trial and error. Every bolt he turned was public, and Bugatti was one of the people watching, silently judging each decision. The tension wasn't really about the car itself. It was about who gets to decide what happens to a machine once it leaves the factory floor. Bugatti's stance was rooted in a long-standing industry belief. Exotic, low-volume hypercars need centralized control to stay safe and to protect the brand's reputation from any outside failure. Armstrong's approach represented the opposite idea, one that's been gaining traction across the rebuild community for years, that with enough skill, patience, and the right resources, almost anything can be fixed outside the factory walls, no matter how complex. The price tag that changed everything. If Bugatti wanted to discourage Armstrong without saying no outright, they found the perfect tool, the invoice. When the Veyron rebuild hit a wall that required an official Bugatti part,
I'm now fulfilling a dream I actually never thought would happen. Driving a Veyron into Monaco with one of my best friends, in a car that we've also rebuilt.
Armstrong did things the proper way, choosing to go through legitimate channels rather than hunting for a workaround. He called the company directly, expecting the kind of straightforward transaction that most repair shops deal with every single day. What followed wasn't a quick fix. It took multiple attempts just to get past customer service, then more calls routed through showrooms in Paris and London before his team finally reached someone who could actually help move the process forward. Eventually, after what felt like an endless chain of transfers and callbacks, they tracked down a service manager who confirmed the part they needed, a fuel pump control module, was sitting in stock at Bugatti's headquarters in Molsheim, France. That should have been good news. Instead, it came with a number that stopped the celebration cold. $59,358 for one module. Not an engine, not a transmission, not some sprawling assembly of parts, just a single control module that in almost any other car would cost a few $100s at most. To put that in perspective, that single component cost more than most new cars sold in the United States, more than a fully loaded family SUV, more than what most people spend on a home down payment. And Bugatti wasn't finished setting terms either. The company required the Veyron itself to be brought into an official service center for installation. a process that would take roughly 2 weeks and hand control of the car back to the very people who didn't want the rebuild happening in the first place. It was a condition that seemed almost designed to undo everything Armstrong had worked toward. For a lot of viewers watching Armstrong's channel, this was the moment the story stopped being about mechanics and started being about power. Bugatti wasn't technically saying no. For a lot of viewers watching Armstrong's channel, this was the moment the story stopped being about mechanics and started being about power. Bugatti wasn't technically saying no. They were pricing the door shut, using the language of business rather than refusal. A 5-figure quote for a single part sends a message without ever using the word refuse, and that made it almost impossible to argue against directly. There was no policy to challenge, no rule to point to, just a number that made the point on its own. Armstrong put down the deposit anyway, unwilling to let the price tag be the thing that ended the project. But instead of shipping the car off and losing weeks of momentum to Bugatti's timeline, he shifted his approach entirely. If Bugatti was going to make this expensive and slow, he'd make his side of it fast and efficient, refusing to hand over any more control than absolutely necessary. He set out to prep the car so thoroughly that whenever the module arrived, installation would take no time at all. It became less about fighting the price, and more about refusing to let the price control his timeline, or dictate the pace of his own work. That decision mattered more than it seemed at the time. It showed Armstrong wasn't just reacting to Bugatti's moves in a passive, defensive way. He was adapting around them, finding ways to keep the project moving, even when every official channel seemed designed to slow him down or wear him out. Viewers who'd followed his other rebuilds recognized the pattern immediately, having seen it play out before with other impossible cars. This is what he does. Obstacles don't stop the build. They just change the plan, forcing him to get more creative rather than more discouraged. The fuel pump saga also did something Bugatti probably didn't intend. It humanized the whole conflict in a way corporate statements never could. A faceless corporate policy is easy to dismiss, easy to scroll past without a second thought. A specific dollar amount, attached to a specific part, tied to a real car sitting in a real garage, is something people can actually picture and get angry about. $59,000 for a module became shorthand across the comment sections for everything people already believed about exotic car ownership, that the real cost was never the car itself, but everything that came after buying it, every repair and every replacement part that followed. By the time the module finally arrived and got installed, the story had already spread far beyond Armstrong's usual audience, reaching corners of the internet that had never heard of him before. Car forums picked it up, dissecting every detail of the invoice. Other YouTubers reacted to it, adding their own commentary and outrage. The number itself became the headline, repeated in video titles and thumbnails long after the actual repair was finished and largely forgotten. Bugatti's silence on the broader criticism only added to the narrative building around the project, one where a billion-dollar manufacturer and a garage mechanic were now locked in something far bigger than a simple parts dispute. What nobody realized yet was that this was only the halfway point. When Bugatti went public, the Chiron Per Sport wasn't Armstrong's car to begin with. It belonged to a friend, a fellow creator who'd bought the wrecked hypercar back from a salvage auction and brought it to Armstrong's shop for help getting it running again. From the outside, it looked like a smaller version of the Veyron story. It turned into something much bigger. Digging into the Chiron, Armstrong's team found damage that went past the visible bodywork. 2 significant tears in the transmission mounts sat underneath the surface repairs, the kind of structural damage that's easy to miss if you're not looking closely and dangerous to ignore if you are. It was exactly the sort of hidden failure Bugatti had warned about all along, the reason they'd been so resistant to outside rebuilds in the first place. But instead of proving Bugatti's caution correct and quietly moving on, the discovery escalated things. The Chiron had already been flagged, blacklisted from receiving official parts entirely. That meant, even if Armstrong wanted to go through proper channels this time, the door was closed before he even knocked. No calls to showrooms, no painful invoices to negotiate. Just an outright refusal to participate in any capacity. This is when the conflict stopped being handled through phone calls and service quotes. Mat Armstrong took to Instagram directly and addressed the situation himself, on camera, to his own audience. For a CEO of a company built on exclusivity and discretion, that was a significant shift. Bugatti wasn't just quietly declining requests anymore. They were actively shaping the public conversation around Armstrong's project, making sure their position was heard clearly and on their own terms. Armstrong's message stuck to the same core argument the company had used from the start. These cars couldn't be guaranteed safe once repaired outside official channels, no matter how skilled the person doing the work might be. But saying it directly, in a video, to a wide audience, carried different weight than a quote passed along through a service center. It turned a private business decision into a public stance, one that invited scrutiny from every angle. Armstrong didn't back down, but he also didn't lash out. In his own response, he made a point of saying he wasn't trying to start a fight with Bugatti. He said he understood the company's position, even if he disagreed with it. What he wanted, he explained, was a path forward that didn't require handing over a car that wasn't fully his to hand over, and didn't come with a price tag built to discourage anyone from trying. There was something almost disarming about his response. He openly admitted surprise that Bugatti's leadership was paying this much attention to a garage build. That admission mattered. It suggested the power dynamic wasn't quite as one-sided as it looked on paper. A company with Bugatti's resources doesn't typically spend its CEO's time addressing a single YouTuber's project, unless that project has become impossible to ignore. The blacklisting of the Chiron parts should have ended that storyline entirely. Instead,
I was so stressed because Bugatti wasn't cooperating with me, selling me parts for the Bugatti, that I lost my fucking hair. So you know what? It's war.
it became one of the most discussed chapters in the entire saga. Proof that Bugatti's caution and Armstrong's persistence were now operating in full public view, with millions of people watching to see which side would give first. What this really means, going forward. The reaction outside Bugatti's headquarters wasn't just a nice moment for Armstrong's channel. It raised a bigger question that the rebuild community has been asking for years. Is the wall between manufacturers and independent mechanics starting to crack? Or was this simply one exception for one exceptional case? There's a strong argument for the second answer. Armstrong isn't a random mechanic working out of a rented garage with limited tools. He's built a business, a reputation, and an audience specifically around doing this kind of work at the highest possible standard. Bugatti's shift in tone likely reflects trust earned through a very specific track record, not a broader change in policy toward rebuilds in general. Most people attempting something similar wouldn't have the resources, documentation, or public accountability that came with every step of Armstrong's process. Still, symbolism matters, even when policy doesn't officially change. For a company as protective of its image as Bugatti, publicly acknowledging outside repair work, even informally, sends a signal to the entire hypercar world. It tells other manufacturers, other rebuilders, and other YouTubers that the line between official and outside work isn't quite as fixed as it once seemed, especially when the results speak for themselves. The Chiron Per Sport remains the unresolved half of this story. It's still blacklisted.
You guys are saying that the car is blacklisted. The car has never been blacklisted in its existence. Bugatti wouldn't do that to its customers or its cars. So please clear up that narrative. Okay, cool. I'll clear that up right now. The car was never blacklisted.
The transmission mount damage discovered earlier hasn't gone away, and Bugatti's position on that specific car hasn't shifted the way it did with the Veyron. That's an important distinction. This wasn't a blanket reversal of Bugatti's stance toward Armstrong's entire operation. It was a response to one finished, proven result. The Chiron will need its own resolution, on its own terms, and there's no guarantee it ends the same way. That uncertainty is part of what makes this story worth continuing to follow. Armstrong hasn't hinted at giving up on the Chiron, and given his track record, backing away isn't really in character. But he's also learned, through months of blacklisted parts and five-figure invoices, that persistence alone doesn't guarantee cooperation. Sometimes it takes a finished product, not just good intentions, to change how a company responds. For the wider rebuild community, this saga offers something rare: proof that the relationship between manufacturers and independent mechanics doesn't have to stay locked in permanent conflict. It can shift, even if slowly, even if only in specific cases. Bugatti didn't hand over its playbook or promise support for every future project like this one. But they showed, in one unscripted moment outside their own headquarters, that results can still speak louder than policy. What happens with the Chiron next will say a lot about whether this was a genuine turning point or a one-time exception. Either way, the Veyron's ending already changed the tone of the conversation, and that's not something easy to undo once it's out in public. This story isn't over. The Veyron proved what Armstrong could do, but the Chiron is still sitting there, blacklisted, waiting for its own resolution. Whether Bugatti responds the same way twice is anyone's guess. And that's exactly why this saga is worth sticking around for. If you want to see how the Chiron chapter plays out, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Drop a comment and tell us what you think. Did Bugatti finally give Armstrong the respect he earned? Or is this still just one exception in a much bigger fight? And if this story pulled you in the way it pulled us in, give this video a like. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one.